When Japan surrendered in 1945, the empire that once stretched across the Pacific collapsed into hunger and silence. Cities lay in ashes, rice fields were trampled and burned, and the people who had been taught that dying for the emperor was the highest honor suddenly found themselves standing in line for food that came from their former enemies. It was not just the buildings of Tokyo or Osaka that were broken. The very idea of what it meant to be Japanese was fractured. And into that vacuum came something entirely foreign: food from America. The first to taste it were the soldiers, men who had spent months surviving on moldy rice and fish bones in the jungles of Burma or the caves of Okinawa, suddenly saw American rations up close: canned meat, white bread, chocolate bars, powdered milk. It was like tasting another planet. They had heard that the Americans were soft, that their luxury made them weak. But now, as they opened a tin of Spam or smelled the sweetness of cocoa, they began to understand that victory had been fueled by something more than steel, by calories, by industrial abundance, by food that never seemed to rot. When the U.S. occupation began, food became a form of diplomacy. The American soldiers handed out Hershey bars to starving children, poured condensed milk into tin cups, and shared their mess hall leftovers with Japanese civilians who had nothing. For many Japanese, their first taste of chocolate or coffee was through the generosity, or curiosity, of occupation troops. The bitter smell of instant coffee became a symbol of both humiliation and fascination. It was alien, strong, and strangely comforting, a drink from the victors sipped by the defeated. In schools and factories, American food aid programs began distributing flour and dried milk. Pancakes and bread appeared on the tables of Tokyo for the first time in generations. Housewives, who once cooked rice and miso soup with seasonal vegetables, learned how to bake with wheat. There were pamphlets explaining how to make American-style meals. Even the term yoshoku, Western-style food, gained new popularity. It was food diplomacy, but also cultural infiltration. The taste of butter and sugar was the taste of reconstruction. And somewhere between the rubble and the ration lines, the old Japanese Navy dish called kare raisu, curry rice, returned. It had been imported from the British Navy during the Meiji era, a thick brown sauce served over rice to feed sailors quickly and cheaply. But in the 1940s it evolved again. The U.S. occupation brought new ingredients: potatoes, carrots, onions, canned beef, and suddenly curry became more than a naval meal. It became survival. In a time when rice was rationed and meat was rare, curry sauce could stretch any scrap of food into a meal. It filled the air of post-war Japan with its spicy foreign aroma, half Indian, half British, and now fully Japanese. The irony was that this dish, born from imperialism, became the food of national recovery. Curry rice was cheap, filling, and forgiving. It could feed a family on almost nothing. Children who had grown up hungry during the war now ate curry in school cafeterias, part of new government nutrition programs supported by American aid. They associated its rich, brown flavor not with colonial humiliation, but with the warmth of being fed. To them, it was not foreign. It was home. Meanwhile, in American military bases across Japan, cooks experimented with local flavors. Some units mixed soy sauce into their stews, others used Japanese vegetables in army recipes. The cultural exchange went both ways, though unevenly. The Japanese learned to eat like Americans out of necessity. The Americans borrowed Japanese techniques out of curiosity. The result was a quiet fusion that spread far beyond the mess hall. By the 1950s, the Japanese domestic food industry had adapted. Instant curry roux, canned sauces, and ready-made mixes began to appear. Advertisements showed smiling families, their faces lit by the glow of a single rice bowl topped with curry. The message was clear. This was modern Japan, rebuilding itself one plate at a time. To outsiders, it might have seemed trivial. Food, after all, is not politics. But in the shadow of war, it was everything. The act of eating, of sharing flavors once considered enemy, was a symbolic surrender and a quiet victory of another kind. The taste of American wheat, the smell of coffee, the sweetness of chocolate, they softened resentment, filled the void of scarcity, and slowly redefined what it meant to be Japanese in a new world order. By the early 1950s, when the occupation officially ended, Japan had absorbed not just American machinery and movies, but American food culture at a cellular level. Fast food stalls began to appear, serving hamburgers alongside bowls of curry. Street vendors sold fried foods, korokke, tonkatsu, modeled after Western cutlets. But beneath it all, the real transformation had already happened. The same people who once believed in divine victory were now building a nation that worshipped efficiency, abundance, and convenience. Curry rice was the edible symbol of that shift, foreign in origin, Japanese in identity. What had started as a necessity became nostalgia. The children who ate curry in the ruins of 1946 grew up to cook it for their own families, unaware that the dish's roots were soaked in defeat. The sweet, thick sauce reminded them of warmth and safety, not surrender. It became a weekly ritual. Curry Friday in schools, curry night at home. The story of curry was the story of Japan itself, burned, rebuilt, and flavored by its contradictions. The soldiers who once drank torpedo fuel to survive now lined up at stalls selling steaming bowls of curry rice. The officers who once commanded men to die for honor now ate spoonfuls of imported wheat thickened with American butter. The children of the occupation grew up under billboards of Coca-Cola and instant curry packets, their lives flavored by empire and adaptation. The war had ended, but its taste lingered, rich, spicy, and unforgettable. Food had become the quiet language of post-war identity. America had introduced abundance, but Japan had transformed it into subtlety. A nation that once measured loyalty by sacrifice now measured progress by flavor. The kitchens of Tokyo became laboratories of cultural negotiation, each meal a compromise between pride and pragmatism. And in the simmering brown sauce of curry rice, history itself found a way to taste good. By the last years of the Pacific War, Japan's empire was starving. The Imperial Navy, once proud and modern, had turned into a desperate fleet running on fumes and improvised supplies. Merchant convoys that carried rice, sugar, and canned goods from Southeast Asia were being sunk faster than they could leave port. The home islands faced blockade, and every gram of food was counted. What had once been a disciplined system of rationing collapsed into chaos as Allied submarines strangled Japan's sea lanes. Hunger became as common a companion to soldiers as their rifles. On the front lines, in Burma, the Philippines, New Guinea, and the island chains of the Pacific, Japanese troops were forced to survive on dwindling supplies. Rice, the sacred foundation of every meal, became a luxury. Soldiers boiled millet, cassava, or even grass mixed with seaweed to imitate the texture of rice. Imperial propaganda told them this was a patriotic sacrifice. Eat for victory, endure for the emperor. But morale decayed faster than the rations themselves. In the dense jungles of New Guinea, entire regiments starved to death without ever seeing battle. Veterans recalled how the rice grains they received were full of insects, and how they mixed them with the pulp of tropical plants to make them last longer. Officers rationed soy sauce like medicine, 1 drop per bowl, to make the illusion of taste. In some desperate moments, soldiers even stole supplies from their own wounded comrades. Hunger turned loyalty into instinct. Back home, civilians shared their suffering. Urban residents learned to stretch every calorie. Housewives cooked imitation rice made from barley and potato flour. Children in Tokyo were taught to clean and reuse cooking water to save salt. The official wartime slogan was, "Luxury is the enemy." But by 1944, even simplicity was a luxury. Street markets vanished. Government rations arrived too late, or not at all. The once prosperous capital became a city of queues. Queues for rice, queues for coal, queues for survival. The military tried to sustain morale with the illusion of self-sufficiency. Propaganda films showed smiling soldiers eating steaming bowls of curry and rice in field kitchens. In reality, most field kitchens were empty. When ships could not deliver rice, the Navy experimented with alternative fuels and foods. It was during this period that some sailors began brewing alcohol from torpedo fuel, a desperate practice that mixed ingenuity with madness. The ethanol-based fuel designed for Type 93 torpedoes was distilled into a crude, drinkable liquid. It became a dark joke in the fleet, the Emperor's torpedo soup. The military obsession with food discipline ran deep. Officers believed that a soldier's stomach was a weapon and that hunger could test loyalty better than combat. In the Japanese Army manual Senjin-kun, written by General Tojo himself, soldiers were ordered to accept starvation as an honor. A soldier must not beg for food, he must live and die with the dignity of the imperial warrior. This belief turned famine into virtue and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Captured documents from Japanese units revealed that by 1945, even elite divisions were operating on half rations. The Imperial Navy's once grand carriers were immobilized not only by fuel shortages, but also by a lack of food for their crews. The sailors who remained spent their days fishing from the decks of ruined ships, boiling whatever they caught in seawater. At night, they sang songs about home-cooked meals, about white rice and miso soup, memories that were fading faster than the empire itself. When American bombers began their systematic destruction of Japan's cities, food became the measure of civilization. Firestorms wiped out rice stores and bakeries alike. In Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya, entire neighborhoods cooked over makeshift stoves built from rubble. Those who had been middle class became scavengers overnight. Even the black markets could not keep up with demand. The currency of survival was no longer yen, but calories. In the spring of 1945, the situation reached absurd extremes. The Japanese government issued pamphlets teaching people how to cook tree bark and acorns. Scientists developed nutrition bricks, compressed blocks made from soy pulp, fish bones, and sawdust to sustain factory workers. The taste was indescribable. One chemist, decades later, confessed that even he could not eat his own invention. In the occupied territories, Japanese forces plundered local resources to survive. In the Philippines and Malaya, rice harvests were confiscated at gunpoint. Civilians were forced to eat roots and banana peels. The resentment this caused was immense. Hunger turned occupied populations into resistance movements. Food was not just sustenance, it was control, and control was slipping away. Meanwhile, in the Pacific Islands, American troops had everything the Japanese did not: canned rations, sugar, coffee, chocolate, cigarettes. The contrast was demoralizing. On Saipan and Guadalcanal, Japanese soldiers who raided American camps after battle described the experience as entering another world. They found metal boxes full of what they called miracle food: beef in tins, powdered eggs, even fruit. Some soldiers cried while eating it, realizing for the first time how far their nation had fallen behind in logistics. To the Americans, food was a system. To the Japanese, it was an ideology. The U.S. Army's Quartermaster Corps treated every soldier as a machine to be fueled. In contrast, Japanese doctrine treated hunger as a moral test. This difference was not abstract. It was visible on the battlefield. The American infantrymen, though exhausted, could march with energy after a full meal. The Japanese infantrymen, equally brave, often marched on nothing but pride and a handful of rice grains. By the final months of the war, when Japan prepared for an Allied invasion that never came, the food crisis became apocalyptic. Civilians were ordered to cultivate every inch of soil. Schoolyards, temple grounds, and even rooftops were turned into vegetable plots. Students were mobilized to collect pine roots for oil production and to dig sweet potatoes for national defense. The government called it total nutrition war. In reality, the empire was collapsing from hunger. Letters from soldiers at Okinawa and Iwo Jima revealed that their last thoughts were not of glory or victory, but of food. One wrote, "I dream of rice balls. I can smell my mother's kitchen before I wake up." It was a universal tragedy. Millions died not from bullets, but from empty stomachs. When the war ended and Japan surrendered in August 1945, the country was physically and spiritually hollowed out. Yet, in the ruins, one of the first questions asked was not about politics or blame. It was, "What shall we eat?" The answer, unexpectedly, would come from the same enemy that had burned their cities. American occupation forces under General MacArthur quickly realized that starvation was a greater threat to stability than any remnant of militarism. Without food, there would be riots. Without nutrition, there would be disease. The U.S. Army distributed millions of tons of surplus rations, wheat flour, and powdered milk. Canned meat and instant soups were unloaded at ports, still blackened from bombing. The sight of American soldiers handing out bread to Japanese children became one of the first images of peace. And thus, the culinary transformation began not in kitchens, but in army warehouses. The same logistical power that had fed millions of American soldiers across the Pacific was now redirected toward feeding their former enemies. U.S. military planners called it Operation Starvation Relief, though for many Japanese it felt like a miracle, the first time in years they could eat until full. In schools, American nutrition experts introduced balanced diets and sanitation lessons. Japanese teachers, many of whom had taught wartime nationalism, now stood before students explaining vitamins and protein. Bread and milk replaced rice and miso soup. It was a new ideology, this time written not in military orders but in recipes. The irony was profound. The war that had been fought for rice fields, an empire ended with wheat and milk from America. Food became the foundation of post-war diplomacy. Every loaf of bread baked in a Tokyo school kitchen was a silent symbol of surrender and rebirth. But before Japan could build its new identity through food, it had to reckon with what hunger had done to its soul. The memory of starvation lingered in every generation that lived through the war. They would never again take food for granted. That memory would shape Japan's post-war industries, its obsession with quality, efficiency, and preservation. Hunger had taught them discipline. Defeat had taught them humility. And so, in the ashes of empire, a new kind of battle began, not for territory, but for taste, for survival, for dignity. The soldiers who once fought with bayonets now built food companies. The chemists who had created wartime nutrition blocks invented instant noodles. The Navy cooks who brewed torpedo soup in desperation helped design the flavor bases of Japan's modern cuisine. The road from starvation to abundance began with that contradiction, that the same nation which had treated hunger as a virtue would later define itself by the art of feeding. The early years of the American occupation reshaped Japan more profoundly than any single battle of the war. Hunger had not disappeared with surrender, it had merely changed its form. The black markets of 1945 were filled with desperate men and women trading anything for calories, heirlooms, jewelry, even clothes. Starvation remained widespread, especially in rural areas where transportation networks had collapsed, and farmers were ordered to deliver crops to the government at fixed prices. Many refused, hiding rice from inspectors while selling small portions illegally to feed their families. Amid this chaos, the Americans understood that feeding Japan was not just charity, it was strategy. A hungry population could turn to rebellion or communism, both unacceptable outcomes in the new global order. Food became the first weapon of reconstruction. The U.S. Army and the newly formed government section under General MacArthur prioritized school lunches, nutrition campaigns, and the introduction of Western staples. For the first time, millions of Japanese children ate bread instead of rice and drank milk instead of tea. What had once been symbols of Western decadence were now instruments of survival. The U.S. supplied huge quantities of wheat flour through the Garrioa, Government Appropriation for Relief in Occupied Areas, program. American nutritionists, most of them women, arrived in Japan to teach classes on balanced diets. They spoke of vitamins and minerals with missionary zeal, and Japanese teachers dutifully translated their lessons into moral slogans. Healthy bodies build a peaceful nation. But beyond official relief efforts, something more subtle began to happen. Food itself became a bridge and a mirror. The occupying soldiers shared their own rations with locals, often out of simple human kindness. Canned meat, instant soup, and chocolate bars circulated in black markets and schoolyards alike. These flavors, alien yet strangely comforting, left deep impressions. The rich, spicy smell of American-style curry powder, an army staple, began to appear in Japanese kitchens. Housewives experimented with it, stretching it with root vegetables and rice to feed families. What had begun as a military ration evolved into an everyday dish. For a country stripped of its old identity, curry was a quiet revelation. It was warm, filling, and forgiving. It accepted whatever ingredients were available. It also carried no shame of defeat. It was neither purely Japanese nor purely foreign. It became a symbol of adaptability, the essence of survival. And so, kare raisu, curry rice, spread from canteens to homes, from schools to factories. Within a decade, it would be as Japanese as sushi. The transformation of Japan's food culture after 1945 was both accidental and inevitable. During the war, industrial food production had been focused on efficiency and preservation. Canned goods, dehydrated meals, powdered substitutes. Those same technologies, refined by necessity, became the seeds of post-war innovation. Chemists who had once developed synthetic soy sauce for soldiers adapted their formulas for mass consumer production. Factories that produced powdered fuel began manufacturing instant soup mixes. The line between military science and culinary science blurred. Some of Japan's most iconic post-war brands emerged directly from this lineage. Morinaga, Meiji, and Nissin were companies that had supplied wartime rations. In the years after surrender, they redirected their expertise toward civilian markets. The founder of Nissin, Momofuku Ando, had seen the chaos of food shortages firsthand. He was arrested in 1948 for trying to distribute food illegally to the poor. The experience convinced him that instant, affordable nourishment was the key to Japan's recovery. A decade later, he invented instant ramen. But before Japan could feed the world with innovation, it had to feed itself. Between 1946 and 1951, the U.S. shipped nearly 4 million tons of food to Japan. The imports included wheat, corn, canned meats, dried milk, and even American-style curry powder. The goal was simple: keep the nation alive. Yet the side effect was cultural transformation. Wheat, once considered a foreign grain, slowly replaced rice as the everyday staple in many urban areas. Bread, noodles, and curry became symbols of modernity, convenient, efficient, and forward-looking. The change was not without resistance. Traditionalists warned that bread would soften the Japanese spirit, that Western food would erase the national character, but the memory of hunger silenced such arguments. For ordinary people, survival came before ideology. Parents cared less about symbolism than about whether their children could eat. The new generation, the first to grow up under occupation, associated Western-style food not with defeat, but with comfort. To them, curry and bread were flavors of peace. School lunches, sponsored by the occupation authorities and later by the Japanese government, became rituals of normalization. Every day, children lined up to receive small bowls of curry rice or vegetable stew, accompanied by milk and a slice of bread. These meals were modest, but they carried immense psychological power. For the first time in years, food was predictable, safe, and enough. Curry's rise was further propelled by its practicality. It was easy to prepare in large quantities and could mask the flavor of cheap or spoiled ingredients, a vital advantage in the years of recovery. The Japanese adapted it to their palate, using roux instead of powder, thickening it with flour, and adding sweetness with apples or honey. The dish evolved from survival food into comfort food. It was the embodiment of Japan's post-war spirit, humble, resilient, and quietly proud. Meanwhile, the country's food industry began to modernize. American aid included not just ingredients, but also machinery, canning equipment, packaging technology, and agricultural tools. By the early 1950s, Japanese factories were producing their own canned curry, soups, and instant noodles. Government initiatives encouraged food companies to adopt scientific management and hygiene standards modeled on American systems. What had started as dependency turned into independence. By the time the occupation formally ended in 1952, Japan had built the foundations of its new culinary identity. It was no longer the land of imperial rations and militarized kitchens. It was a nation discovering the joy of eating again. In post-war literature and cinema, food became a metaphor for recovery. Writers described the taste of bread with reverence, as if it symbolized both nourishment and forgiveness. Films portrayed mothers saving scraps of curry for their children as acts of quiet heroism. The irony was not lost on anyone. The same empire that had once fought to dominate Asia's rice supply now defined its daily life by Western imports. Yet this transformation did not feel like submission. It felt like evolution. The Japanese had not simply copied their occupiers' food, they had absorbed it, reinterpreted it, and made it their own. In the process, they turned humiliation into creativity. By the mid-1950s, as Japan entered its period of rapid economic growth, curry rice had become a national dish. It appeared in homes, in the military, in restaurants, and even on trains. The Self-Defense Forces, Japan's new post-war military, adopted it as a weekly meal tradition. Every Friday, bases across the country served curry rice to their troops, a quiet echo of the past. It was a way of honoring the old Navy's practice, transformed from desperation into routine. Thus, the cycle had completed itself. The weapon that once symbolized conquest, food, had become the foundation of peace. Through taste, Japan redefined its identity. The bitterness of war was replaced by the mild spice of curry, the flavor of resilience. By the dawn of the 1960s, Japan had transformed from a nation haunted by hunger into one defined by abundance. The generation that had once scavenged for scraps now watched television commercials celebrating instant meals, canned coffee, and colorful curry packages. The taste of war had faded, replaced by the flavor of convenience. Yet beneath this surface of prosperity lay a quiet continuity, a memory encoded in the food itself. Curry rice remained the most powerful symbol of that continuity. What had begun as a mixture of leftover rations and imported spice had become a mirror of Japan's post-war evolution. Each spoonful carried traces of history, the colonial influences from Britain and India, the American occupation, the ingenuity of Japanese homemakers, and the industrial rebirth that followed. To eat curry in 1960s, Tokyo was to taste both defeat and renewal, a story of survival rewritten as comfort. As the economy boomed, food companies turned this history into branding. Advertisements presented curry as the flavor of modern family life, a meal for mothers, students, and salarymen alike. Its aroma filled small apartments and train stations, blurring the line between domestic warmth and industrial efficiency. Even the Japanese self-defense forces kept the tradition alive. Every Friday, sailors and soldiers ate curry rice together, a ritual inherited from the Imperial Navy's old schedules. It was no longer about discipline or rationing. It was about unity, nostalgia, and continuity. The military origin of the dish became folklore rather than shame. Children learned that their grandfathers had once eaten curry at sea, and that the nation's favorite comfort food had been born from survival. Television programs and magazines turned this story into a cultural myth, the tale of how Japan's most beloved meal had come from the machinery of war. What once symbolized deprivation now represented resilience. Meanwhile, Japan's new food industry exported this reinvented identity to the world. Instant noodles, canned curry, and convenience snacks became global ambassadors of Japanese ingenuity. The factories that had once produced rations for soldiers now shipped products to Asia, Europe, and America. Food, once a weapon of survival, had become a language of peace. By the 1980s, Japan's military flavors had completed their transformation. Curry rice was institutionalized in schools, workplaces, and homes. Every child who lined up for a school lunch of curry and milk was unknowingly participating in a ritual born of defeat and remade through hope. The bitterness of occupation had been replaced by the mild sweetness of post-war spice. The lessons of starvation had evolved into a culture of sharing, discipline, and memory. Looking back, historians began to realize that Japan's post-war recovery was not only economic or political, it was gastronomic. The act of eating together, of transforming foreign food into something national, had restored a sense of dignity that no speech or treaty could provide. Through taste, Japan learned how to live again. Even today, the story remains visible in small ways. Every naval base in Japan still serves curry on Fridays. Each region gives it a unique twist. Some add seafood, others use local vegetables or special spices. The recipes are published publicly, turning a military tradition into a national celebration. Once, curry was born from necessity. Now, it is born from pride. The same can be said of Japan itself. From the ashes of war and the hunger of occupation, it built a culture that transformed loss into creativity. The torpedo soups, the synthetic soy sauce, the military rations, all relics of a desperate age, became stepping stones to innovation. Food was never just sustenance. It was a record of the human will to endure to adapt, and to find meaning even in absurdity. Thus, what began as a tragic consequence of war ended as a quiet triumph of humanity. The story of Japan's post-war food is the story of a nation that refused to let hunger define its destiny. It is a reminder that sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin not with weapons, but with something as simple as a shared meal, warm, humble, and spiced with memory.